In this Blender tutorial, I'm going to show you how to speed up your render times in the Cycles render engine. Now, these aren't scene-specific things. These 6 tips work for pretty much any scene that you're doing in Blender. Just a couple quick things I wanted to go over before we get started. If you'd like to help support this channel, some great places to do that are over on my Gumroad store and my Patreon page. And on my Gumroad and Patreon, you can get 3D models and assets, tutorial files, artwork project files, and procedural materials, things like that on my Gumroad and Patreon. You can also join the YouTube memberships. So if you click on the little join button down there next to the subscribe button, you can support me monthly and you'll get some cool perks here on YouTube. And then just one last thing before we get started, I wanted to thank Sketchfab for sponsoring this video. Sketchfab is an awesome 3D model site where you can preview 3D models in your browser. You can even view them on a phone, tablet, or in AR and VR. They also have a huge 3D model store where you can purchase models and assets. You can even apply to sell your own models on the platform. Check out Sketchfab with the link in the description. Alright, so here I am in Blender, and what I did is I actually went File, and I actually went to Defaults and then loaded up the factory settings, and then I just imported this little scene right here. Now you totally don't need to do that, you don't need to load up the factory settings. Why I did that is because I already have some things set up on default so that the render is faster, and I'm just doing that for the sake of the video so that we can use the defaults of Blender, the default Blender preferences, and then speed it up as we go. So I'm just going to press F12 to render out the image, and we'll see how long it takes. Now you can see right up here, if you want to see how long the render is taking, you can see right up here in the corner, there's some different data that will show you how long the render is taking. So there's the time right here. You can see we're almost at 20 seconds. There's also the remaining time. So this is like Blender estimating how long it thinks it's going to take. It doesn't look like it's doing the best job though, because it's actually going really fast, like faster than seconds. And then also there's like a frame right here. So if you want to see what frame you're on, it says frame 1. If you're doing like an animation, that can be really helpful as well. And if you'd like to watch tutorials on how to create some of these things, I have a tutorial on how to create this Rubik's Cube. I'll leave the link in the description. And then also if you'd like to watch the tutorial on how to create this T scene, I'll leave the link in the description. I have a tutorial on that as well. All right, so it finished and you can see we are at 58 seconds. Now, one really cool thing with Blender that I wanted to show you is the render slots. So as you're comparing your render, you can actually use these right up here. These are Blender's render slots, and you can compare your renders. So the default, it's on slot 1. You can change it to slot 2, and then you can render again. And then when you render, it's going to show you the time of that render, and it's going to display the render right here. So then you can go back to render slot 1, and you can compare the different renders. So you can compare like how much noise it is and how it looks, and then you can also compare the render time. So we're going to be using that in this video. Now there are shortcut keys to changing the slots. So the top numbers on your keyboard, you can press 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on, and it's going to change the render slot. So that is super helpful for comparing your different renders. All right, so I'm just going to escape out of this. So let's get started with the first way you can speed up your render times. So the first way you can speed up your render times, and probably the best way to speed up your render times, is to use a GPU if you have one. So some computers come with GPUs, some computers don't. Usually like gaming computers will definitely have a GPU because GPUs are a graphics card, so that's what they're made for. They're made for rendering and doing complex things. And I also built my own computer, so I could choose like what components I wanted to put into it because I built it myself. So I put a GPU in my computer. But if you just have something like a laptop or just like a home desktop computer, they don't always have GPUs. So it's really just going to depend on your computer and your hardware. If you're able to get a GPU and add it into your computer, that's going to really help because GPUs are very powerful graphics cards and they're meant for doing things like rendering. But I know that not everyone has a GPU, and I know not everyone can afford to get a GPU. So if you can only use your CPU, that is fine. Let me just show you how you can speed up your render times with your GPU. So if you have a GPU, you can see that there's the device right here, and there's CPU and there's GPU compute. Now the GPU compute, it might be grayed out. And if it's grayed out, then that's probably because you need to set it up in your Blender preferences. Or it could also just mean that you don't have a GPU in your computer. So let me just show you how to set this up. So to set it up, you need to go right here to Edit, and then you need to click on the preferences. And then you're just going to go right over here to system, and you can see that it says cycles render device, and these are your GPU render settings. So there are a bunch of different things right here. You can see there's OpenCL, optics, and CUDA, and these are really going to depend on what GPU you have, because I believe some GPUs will work for these certain ones and some GPUs won't. So it really depends. I have a GeForce RTX 280 Super. That's the GPU I have. So I am able to use this optics, and I would recommend using optics. I think it's the best, but you could also use these other ones as well. You can see if I click on the OpenCL, it says no compatible GPUs. So my GPU doesn't work for this. I'm just going to be using optics because that works really well. So I'm just going to check mark this, and then I can just close this. So then what I just need to do is change it from CPU to GPU compute, and then we can render this again. Now, before we render it again, I'm going to hit F11, and that's going to bring up the render result. And then I'm just going to click on 2, or just click on the render slot 2, and then we can render this and compare it. So now let's hit F12 to render, and it's going to use my GPU. And you can see here is the time. So while it's rendering, I can click on 1, and that's going to go back to the render slot 1, or I can click on 2, and it's going to go to the render slot 2. So I can like zoom in and compare them. So you can see like it looks a tiny bit different, but not that much. There's like a tiny little bit of change in the noise. All right, and it finished. So you can see the time here is 38 seconds, where if I click on 1 to go to the first one, that was with my CPU, and that is 58 seconds. So you can see my GPU is quite a bit faster than my CPU. Now, there's a really cool thing with this. Let me just close this. If I go edit, and then I go to the preferences, you can see that I am able to also render with my GPU and my CPU. Now, I'm not quite sure if this works for every GPU and CPU, and it may not work for all of these different settings, but with the hardware that I have and how I have this set up, I am actually able to render with both of them. So that is super awesome. So I'm going to turn them both on, but then I'm still going to have this set to GPU compute. Then what I can do is press F11 again, and I'm going to go this time to render slot 3, and then I can just press F12 to render this out. And you can see, there we go. It's going really quite fast. And it finished at only 25 seconds. So we started with 58. We've already cut it down to 38 with our GPU. And then with both GPU and CPU rendering, we've cut it down to 25 already. So that is really great. Let's just escape out of this. So that is super awesome. So you can definitely play around with that and see if you're able to save some render times. So that is the first tip to use your GPU if you have one. All right, now the second tip definitely depends on if you're using your GPU or your CPU, and that is to change the tile size. So when you're rendering this, when we were rendering, you could see that there are these little tiles, and basically it just renders each tile and then goes along and renders the different tiles. Let me just render it again. So I'll press F11. All right, and then I'll just press F12 to render. So if you're rendering with your CPU, then every core of your CPU is going to be one tile. If you're rendering with your GPU, or if you have multiple GPUs, each GPU is going to be one tile. Now, because I'm rendering with my CPU and GPU, it's just using all the tiles because I have a bunch of different cores in my CPU. My CPU has 12 cores. But then if I just go right back here to the preferences, if I just render with my GPU, you can see because I just have one GPU, it's only going to render one tile. Although my GPU is really fast, quite a bit faster than my CPU. So don't think that more tiles means that it's going to render faster, because when I just render with my GPU or just render with my CPU, even though my GPU only has one tile, it actually renders a lot faster than just with rendering with my CPU. All right, but I got a little sidetracked there. What I was talking about, the second tip, is if you change your tile size, that can actually make your render faster. If you click on the Performance tab, and this is on the render properties, you can see that there is the tile size. So right here it says tiles. So you can actually tell Blender how big or small you want the tiles to be. Now, generally speaking, if you're rendering with your CPU, smaller tiles are going to be better. And if you're rendering with your GPU, larger tiles are going to be better. So CPU, smaller tiles, GPU, larger tiles. And don't ask me why this works. I really actually don't quite know. I guess it just has to do something with how the hardware is created. So you can make your tiles smaller if you're rendering with your CPU and your tiles bigger if you're rendering with your GPU. Now, wouldn't it be nice if you could just tell Blender to do this automatically? Well, you actually can. There is a Blender add-on, it's built into Blender, which will automatically change your tile size. So I just have it turned on default. Let me just show you how to use it. So right here, you're going to go edit, and then you're just going to go to the preferences. And then right over here on the add-ons, you can just start to type in auto. And you can see it's built into Blender, render auto tile size. So I'm just going to turn this on, and then I can just close this. And now that I've closed that, you can see it says performance auto tile size. And just to make sure this is working, I'm just going to go over here to the preferences, just jump over here to system. I'm just going to render with my GPU. So I'm going to hop over to render slot 4, and then I'll hit F12. So you can see, look at that, Blender made the tile size a lot bigger because it's a GPU. I'm rendering with my GPU. And then let me just escape out of this. I'm just going to go back to the preferences. And this time we'll just render it with my CPU. You can see it got grayed out because I only am rendering with my CPU now. So it's grayed out. I can just hit F12 and you can see, look at that. It made the tiles really, really small because we're rendering with my CPU. So I'm just going to escape out of this. Let me just go again to the preferences. I will just render with both of them now, and we can actually do our render test. So we are on slot 4. Let's hit F12 to render. All right, and it finished. And in this case, it actually took a second longer because you can see here's 25 and then here's 26. What I can do, if you click right here, this is going to show you some of the settings in the auto tile size. In this case, I'm just going to change this to 128 instead of 256. And especially if you're only doing CPU or only doing GPU rendering, this has an even bigger effect because again, you want to use bigger tiles when you're on your GPU. So I think something like 256 is pretty good for a GPU. And then if you're rendering with your CPU, smaller tile sizes are going to be better. So something like 16 or 32. Now, if you want manual control, you can just turn that add-on off. And then right here, you can just change the tiles. So something around 16 to 32 for a CPU, and then 256 or 512 is pretty good for a GPU. So you can just change the tile size right there manually if you'd like to. For my setup, I'm just going to change it to the 128, and then I'll press F12 to render that again. And there we go, and it finished, and it shaved off another second. So it wasn't very much in this case, it already is going pretty fast, but even when I'm just doing like an animation, just shaving off 1 second can really help as well. So that is the second tip to change your tile size. All right, now the third tip, this is a pretty obvious one, but it's to turn down your samples. So obviously when you turn your render samples down, it's going to render faster, but it's not going to look quite as good. It's going to be more grainy. And then when you turn your samples up, it's going to be less grainy. But there are many cases where you can actually turn the samples quite a bit more down and the grain isn't really going to change that much. So if I change this to like 400 and then I'll press F11, I can just change this to slot 5 now, and we will render this out. And it finished. Now this one took 1 minute and 12 seconds, so this took a lot longer, even more than we started, but we also turned the render samples way up. But the thing about this is that if you compare this to the original one, which I believe was only 128 samples, that was the default, you can see here is the fourth one. So you can see it definitely is a bit more grainy, and then here's the fifth one. So it does look a little bit nicer, but it took a lot longer to render. This one only took 24 seconds, and then this one took 1 minute and 12 seconds. So it's way longer, and you're not actually getting very much of a benefit. And this comes alongside with my next tip, which is to use a denoiser. So what a denoiser does is it goes over the render after it's finished and it smooths it all out and denoises all the little bits of grain. And what it will help you to do is to turn down your render samples and still get a really good result. So before we use Blender's denoiser, I need to turn on what's called denoising data, and that is data that Blender will use to help denoise the image. So if you click right over here on the view layer properties, right down here under data and then include, you can see that there is this denoising data. So I'm just going to turn this on, and then we just need to render it again so it'll have the denoising data. So right here I am in slot 5, and then I will just hit F12 to render again. Now you can see the previous one was 1 minute and 12 seconds, and this one is 1 minute and 16 seconds. So turning on the denoising data does make it render just a little bit longer because it has a little bit more to calculate. But once we turn on the denoiser, it's going to smooth this all out, and then we'll be able to turn down the samples and it'll still look really nice. So to actually activate the denoiser, we need to use Blender's compositor. So there is a tab right here called compositing. I'm just going to click on this, and then you need to click on use nodes. So what we need to do is we need to add the denoiser right in here in the compositing. So I'm going to press Shift A and I'm going to search for denoise, and here's the denoise node. This is an amazing node. And then I have the Node Wrangler add-on turned on. So what I can do is just hold down the Control and Shift key and click on the denoise, and that's going to add the viewer node. You can also just press Shift A and search for a viewer node and then just plug it up. So you can see if I Control Shift and click on this, I'm just going to zoom in here so you can see how noisy it is, and then I will Control Shift and click on the denoise and just wait for it to load up, and you can see it smoothed it out a lot. Now you can also use the denoising data to make it look even nicer. So you can take the denoising normal. If I just Control Shift and click on this, you can see here's the data that it's using. So it actually has normal data, and I'm going to plug that into the normal. You can see there it is before, and then I'll plug it up, and there it is after. Now you may not really notice anything. It is subtle, but it can help just a little bit. And then the albedo, you can also take the denoising albedo. So this is what it looks like. So it basically takes all the color data, and this can also help to make your render look just a little bit nicer. So I'm going to plug the albedo into the albedo, the normal into the normal. Here it is before, and then here it is after. So again, it doesn't change it that much, but it can help a little bit. Now, for most scenes, I actually prefer not to use the denoising normal, just because I really find that for most scenes, it doesn't actually make it look that much nicer, and it does make the render times take a bit longer to render. For some scenes, I do find that they are pretty helpful, but for most things that I do, I just don't use them. So what I'm going to do is just go right over here to the view layer properties, and then I'm going to turn off the denoising data. Then I can press F11, and I'm just going to change to a slot 6, and I can now press F12 to render again, and then I just have the image plugged up to the image and then the viewer and composite. So right back over here, here's the render, and then we'll be able to compare it with and without the denoiser. And it finished at only 1 minute and 14 seconds. Now, the time it takes to composite is like a couple of seconds. It does take just a moment to composite, but you can see this image looks really, really nice. If I just go right back up here, so you can see here is slot 6, and then here is slot 5. So you can see this is what the denoise does. It looks really, really nice. So now we come back to tip number 3, which is turning down the samples. So now that we have this denoiser, we can actually turn the samples way down, and we'll be able to get it even faster than our 24 seconds, which is before we turn the render samples way up to 400. So if I escape out of this, the render samples, I'm just going to turn this to like 80, so quite a bit less. And then I am just going to change this to slot 7, and then I'll just hit F12 to render. So we're actually using even less samples than we used before, because the default of Blender was 128. So we're only using 80, so it is a lot less samples. So it's going to be even more grainy, but the denoise node is really going to help to smooth it out. And you can see, look at that. It's really, really nice. It looks really good. And you can see the time was only 17 seconds. Now, you might argue that the render samples are a little bit too low, because if you do zoom in, there are a few things that are starting to look a little bit smudgy. If you turn the render samples way too low, like maybe only 10, then when it denoises, it does actually kind of look smudgy. So you can see right here, you can definitely start to see it, but this is way less than the 400 samples, and it's rendering a lot faster. So basically what you can do is you can turn down the render samples to as small as you can possibly get them, while still keeping a nice looking image. So for this scene, something like 100 is probably going to be good. So I will just render that again, and it finished at only 20 seconds, and it really looks quite nice. So this is render slot 4. This is before we added the denoise with 128 samples, and then here is render slot 7 with the denoise and only 100 samples. So you can see it really smoothed it out, and it actually looks quite nice. All right, so tip number 5 is to turn down your light bounces. So what light bounces are is they are Blender calculating the light bouncing around. Now in the real world, light pretty much bounces off of everything, and it's just constantly bouncing. And when it bounces off of a mirror, it bounces a lot more. But then when it bounces off of like something that's really rough, like a brick wall, it's not going to bounce quite as well. And so when Blender is rendering, it actually needs to calculate those light bounces. So, you know, like here is a light, and then the light would shine down on the monkey, and then it would bounce off of the monkey, and the monkey has like a metal material, and then it would bounce from the ground off, and then maybe it would bounce on the Rubik's Cube, and it just continues to go, and it goes as far as you tell it to. So right over here on the render properties, you can see that there is this light paths tab, and on default, they're actually turned up quite high, and for most things, for most scenes, you're really not going to need these to be turned up quite that high. So what I'm going to do is just turn them all off, and then we'll turn them back up as we need them, because we do need a few, and it really depends on your scene. Each scene is going to be a little bit different. So I'm going to go into rendered mode, and then what I'm also going to do right here on the denoising, I'm just going to turn on the viewport denoising, and I'm going to turn on to optics just so that we can see how the image looks in the view. Alright, so to turn these all down at once, you can actually click on the top one, drag down, and then let go, and then type in 0 and enter, and it's going to turn them all off. Now already you can see that this looks quite bad, and I actually did this on purpose because now we can just turn it up to the smallest amount that we need. So these are actually transparent because they are like these little steam photos, and then this right here, this is a glass cup, so it does need some transparency, and then this needs a few light bounces so that it can actually bounce off of the metal and have that reflectivity. So what we can first do is right here you can see there's the total. Let's turn that up to 1, and then diffuse and glossy, let's also turn that up to 1 as well. So these three are at 1. Already you can see that looks a lot better. These things still don't look very good, but the monkey head already looks really good at just 1 bounce. Now to fix the transparency, we're going to need Blender to render a few transparencies. So if I just turn this up to 1, now you can see it's going to be able to go through 1 transparency, but you can see that there's a bunch of transparent layers on top of each other because there are a bunch of different smoke images. So I'm going to turn it up again. So transparency to 2, to 3, to 4, and 5, and you can see that looks pretty good, but there actually is a little bit of a shadow right there. So I'll turn it up to 6. That looks a little bit better. I'm going to change it up to 7 though, and you can see now that shadow completely goes away. So this is really just going to depend on your scene, because if your scene has any transparency, you're going to need to use it. But if your scene doesn't have any transparency, you can probably just turn it all the way to 0, and as long as it doesn't look any different, then that's going to really help your render times. Alright, so the scene is almost looking back to normal, but we still have this black glass cup. So how we change this is by turning up the transmission. So I'm going to turn up to 1, and you can see nothing really changes. Let's change it up to 2 again. Now you can see still nothing is changing. That's because the total, we need to turn that up as well. So let's turn this up to 2. You can see now it's able to go through the glass once. You can see it's going through the glass twice because the glass has a little bit of thickness. Let's do it again. So let's turn the transmission up to 3, and then we'll change the total up to 3. And you can see it went through 1 more of the layers, so it looks a little bit nicer. Let's turn them both up again. So the transmission, we'll turn that up to 4, and then the total to 4. You can see now it's able to go all the way through, but you can see the bottom of the glass still doesn't look very good. Let's turn them both up to 5, so the total and transmission, that looks a bit better. And you can see when I turn it up to 8, you can see it really starts to look normal again. So it still looks a little bit gray, but that looks a lot better. So I'm just going to go over to the 8th render slot, and then we'll just hit F12 to render again. Alright, and it finished, so we shaved off another second. This one is 19, whereas the one before was 20. Now you can see there are still a few things. There's like these black things here, and you can also see that it gets a little bit darker. And that is because if I escape out of this, that's because we need to turn up the diffuse and glossy, because right now they're just set to 1. So if we just turn these up to like 2, you can see right there in that monkey head, you can see with 1, it's a little bit darker. And then actually with just the glossy, I can just turn up the glossy just to 1 because it's a metal material, so it's glossy, and that already looks way better. And now our scene looks pretty much back to how it was. So really you can just turn these down to as low as you can while still keeping the image looking nice. Now there is also this clamping right here, and you can see on default the direct is turned to 0, the indirect is turned to 10. I'm just going to render this out again, and it finished at only 19 seconds. Let's just escape out of this. I'm going to go into rendered mode. If I turn the indirect light from 10, which is the default, if I turn it all the way to 0, you can see it pretty much doesn't look any different at all. I can't even see any change. So the render doesn't look any different, but let's render this now and we'll see how long it takes. So this one is at 1962, and then we'll wait for that to finish. And this one is only 1945. So again, it is a small change, but it does speed up the render time turning this off. All right, so we are down to the last tip. Tip number 5 is to turn off the caustics. So you can see the caustics are right here, and on default they're turned on. There's the reflective and refractive caustics. Now for most scenes you're really not going to need the caustics, but if you are having light shining through glass, that is one of the main things why you might want to keep the caustics. Now in this scene it's really hard to see the caustics, and that is because everything is so bright and there is an HDRI. I just added in HDRI lighting to get realistic lighting. The strength here on the HDRI, I'm just going to turn it all the way to 0, and I also need to just hide this light right here. So now we're only going to render with this one light. So you can see if I just box select this light right here is shining through the glass cup, and right here these are the caustics. So this does help to make the scene look more photorealistic, but for most things that you're doing you're not really going to need them. Let me just turn it off to show you. So if I turn it off, you can see that didn't really do anything. If I turn this one off though, now you can see that it's all black, and that does not look realistic at all. You can see in this case the reflective caustics doesn't do much. It does a little bit but not much. But then if I turn on the refractive caustics, that is really where that starts to look a lot more realistic. So I just pressed Ctrl Z and went back to my original scene with the HDRI lighting. So what I'm going to do is just turn these off, and then I can just press F11. So we've run out of render slots, but you can see the last image took 19 seconds, 1945. So we'll just render that again and we'll see how much faster it renders. And there we go. It finished at 17 seconds instead of 19 seconds. So that definitely speeds it up. It is just a few more seconds, but it adds up over time, especially when you're doing something like an animation. So there we go. If we click way back on 1, this original one, it took us 58 seconds and it's quite grainy. And then way over here on our last render slot, we're all the way down to 17. So we went from almost a minute to only 17 seconds, and the render looks quite a bit nicer and it's very smooth. So just to recap, we have use your GPU if you have one, and you could also try using your GPU and your CPU at the same time, and that will render even faster. And then the second tip is to change your tile size. So CPUs work better with smaller tile sizes, and then GPUs work better with bigger tile sizes. And then the third and fourth tip kind of go hand in hand. So use less samples and then use the denoiser to smooth out your image, and then you can turn the samples even more down and it's going to look really nice. So use less samples and use the denoiser. And then the fifth one is to turn down the light bounces. You can really turn the light bounces way down and the scene won't change that much. And then the fifth tip is to turn down the caustics, because for most scenes you're really not going to be using the caustics and it can really speed up your render times. So that's going to be it for this video. I hope you enjoyed the video and thank you for watching. And I hope to see you in a future video.